My brother called me a loser and banned me from Christmas dinner. What no one at that table knew was that I'd been quietly financing his entire life for 5 years. $2,000 a month, every month. Mortgage help. Temporary emergencies, just until things stabilize. The same week he told me there was no place for losers at his Christmas table, I discovered he'd been running a secret account behind everyone's back. While I was working overtime to keep his family afloat, Jacob was telling people I was unsuccessful, that I couldn't contribute, that I didn't understand money. Meanwhile, my bank statements told a different story. Every transfer I sent disappeared within hours. Every emergency reset on schedule. Every month ended the same way, with me paying and him insisting he was still struggling. On social media, he talked about discipline, smart decisions, building a future. At Christmas, he talked about standards. That was the moment something finally clicked. Not anger, not hurt. Clarity. I stopped sending money. What followed wasn't chaos, it was exposure. Bills that had always been manageable suddenly weren't. Stories that had held together for years started to crack. People who'd never questioned where the money came from began asking why it was gone. By the time I understood what I'd actually been financing, it was already too late for Jacob to rewrite the story. And that's when I realized something else. Some people don't lose support because they're unlucky. They lose it because the truth finally shows up. It didn't start as a system, it started as help. 5 years ago, Jacob called about a rough month, car trouble, an unexpected medical bill. $800, he said, just to get through. He'd pay me back when his next project came through. The project never materialized, the calls kept coming. Mortgage short by $1,200, school supplies, $400, heating bill overdue, $350. Each time Jacob had a reason. Each time he had a plan to catch up. Each time that plan quietly disappeared. By year 3, the pattern was obvious. $2,000 a month wasn't temporary anymore. It was expected. Sometimes $2,500 when emergencies came up. Car payments, insurance, groceries, daycare. I covered everything that mattered while Jacob handled what he called the smaller stuff. The request came through text, always casual, always assumed. Hey, need the usual this month. Can you handle the mortgage again? Kids need winter clothes. You know how it is. Never please, never thanks, never I know this is a lot. When I sent the money, I'd get a thumbs up emoji. Occasionally a got it. That was the extent of the acknowledgement. Jacob talked about my financial contributions the way people talk about utilities, predictable, reliable, not worth mentioning. At family gatherings, he'd talk about his smart budgeting and careful planning. He never mentioned the $2,000 hitting his account every month like clockwork. At some point, I stopped being his brother and became a line item. My transfers showed up on his calendar, not in his gratitude. If I sent the money late, he'd follow up. If I asked questions, he'd get defensive. The support was no longer optional. It was assumed. And once something is assumed long enough, people stop thinking about where it comes from. What started to bother me wasn't the money. I could afford it. It was the disconnect. New stainless steel appliances in a kitchen that supposedly needed budget repairs. Designer backpacks for kids whose school supplies I paid for. Date nights at restaurants that cost more than my weekly groceries. On the same days Jacob texted about being short on rent, he'd post photos from expensive dinners. When I visited, nothing looked strained. Nothing looked temporary. Everything looked comfortable. If I was covering the big expenses, then one question kept coming back to me. Where was Jacob's money actually going? Christmas Eve arrived the same way it had for the previous 4 years. I loaded my car with presents, $500 worth, chosen carefully for each family member. Jacob's kids got the video games they'd mentioned. Qley got the jewelry she'd hinted about. I even brought a homemade apple pie, the kind my mother used to make. I showed up early, like always, planning to help with setup. Christmas had become my one chance to see where all that monthly support was actually going, to spend time with the family I'd been investing in, to feel like the money meant something beyond numbers on a bank statement. When Jacob answered the door, his smile didn't reach his eyes. He didn't step aside to let me in. He stayed planted in the doorway, blocking the view behind him. Hey, he said, his voice was tight. Over his shoulder, I caught glimpses of the house. Fresh flowers on the dining table, new decorations, the smell of expensive wine, and a prime rib roast. This wasn't a family cutting corners to make Christmas work. This was a family celebrating comfortably. We need to talk, Jacob said, stepping outside and pulling the door closed behind him. The cold air hit us both. Jacob stared at me like I was a problem he needed to handle. This is awkward, he said. Qley and I have been talking. We want a different kind of Christmas this year, something more selective, just successful family members. I thought about the $2,000 I'd transferred 3 days earlier, the rent I'd covered 2 weeks before that, 5 years of support that made this house possible. Jacob, what are you saying? I'm saying there's no place for losers at our Christmas table. The words carried. The kids were watching through the window now. Qley stood behind the door, silent. Jacob wasn't whispering, he wanted it understood. Standing there holding gifts I'd paid for, I finally saw it clearly. I hadn't been helping my brother. I'd been financing a version of his life that didn't include me. I didn't send the January payment. For the first time in 5 years, the first of the month came and went without a transfer to Jacob's account. I waited to see how long it would take him to notice. 3 days. Hey, just checking on this month's help, came the text on January 4th. Casual, like maybe I'd forgotten. Mortgage payment went through on the 3rd. Need $2,400 to cover it. I didn't respond. By January 6th, the tone changed. Michael, call me. We need to sort this out. Payment bounced. When I answered, Jacob's voice was higher than usual, tighter. What happened with the transfer? He asked. The bank says there wasn't enough to cover the mortgage. They're charging overdraft fees. I stopped sending money. Silence. Long enough to register. Very funny, he said, but seriously, what's going on? That's when it clicked. I hadn't been helping, I'd been holding everything together. The entitlement dropped away the moment he realized I wasn't joking. Rio, Michael, you can't just stop, he said. We've got bills, commitments, the kids. You'll figure it out, I said. The panic came fast. Think about the kids, he pushed. They didn't do anything wrong. Family should stick together. Family. From the man who'd told me there was no place for losers at his table. When guilt didn't work, irritation took over. You're being petty, Jacob snapped. I said something stupid. You're going to punish my whole family over one comment? He still wasn't apologizing. He was negotiating. After the call ended, my phone stayed quiet for hours. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the expectation that I'd cool off and fix it, the way I always had. That silence told me more than anything Jacob had said. He wasn't panicking because he'd hurt me. He was panicking because the system he relied on had stopped working. For the first time, the pressure was on him instead of me. Late fees were his problem now. Explanations were his problem. And the longer I didn't step in, the clearer it became how much of their stability had been resting on money they'd never really earned. 2 days later, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Jacob. Michael? Qley's voice was quiet, careful. Can we talk? She'd never called me directly before. In 5 years, everything had gone through Jacob. I know things got awkward at Christmas, she said. I wasn't okay with what Jacob said. There was a pause, then lower. Can we meet somewhere private? There are things you should know about where the money's been going. Something in her voice told me she understood exactly why the transfers had stopped, and that whatever she was about to say, it wasn't small. 3 weeks without my money, and their life started to crack. The utility company sent a shut-off notice. The car finance company called about missed payments, warning of repossession. Jacob's texts became frantic, not apologetic, just urgent. Emergency with the heat bill. Need help with the car payment ASAP. Kids asking why the Wi-Fi doesn't work. Each message exposed how thin the margin had always been. Without my transfers, there was no buffer, no savings, no fallback. Every expense that had been manageable with my support turned into a crisis without it. Jacob had always claimed things were tight but under control. 3 weeks proved otherwise. You don't go from stable to desperate that fast unless you were never stable to begin with. Qley's text came later that evening. Can you meet me at the coffee shop on Maple Street tomorrow? 2 p.m.? Please don't tell Jacob. She'd never asked me to keep anything from him before. In 5 years, every conversation had gone through Jacob. Asking for secrecy meant she was stepping outside the system she'd been living in. I have something to show you, she followed up. About the finances. Things I should have told someone a long time ago. I arrived early and chose a table in the back corner. Qley walked in looking exhausted. She hadn't slept. Her hands shook as she sat down and placed a manila envelope on the table between us. I need you to understand something first, she said quietly. Jacob gets angry when I ask questions about money. I stopped asking a long time ago. She took a breath. But after you stopped helping, I couldn't ignore it anymore. She opened the envelope. Inside were printed statements, receipts, and screenshots from accounts I didn't recognize. The first page was a bank statement from an account I'd never heard of. Jacob's name was on it, but it wasn't the account I'd been sending money to. He opened this 2 years ago, Qley said. I only found out last month when a statement came to the house by mistake. The transactions were all withdrawals. Large ones, 500, 800, sometimes over 1,000 in a single day. Always late at night, always in cash. Qley didn't say what it was for. She didn't have to. Looking at the pattern, I understood one thing clearly. What unsettled me wasn't just the amount, it was the timing. The withdrawals clustered around the same days Jacob used to text me about being short on cash. The same nights he'd claim something unexpected had come up. Looking back, the emergencies followed a rhythm. One I'd been unknowingly keeping alive. Qley watched my face change as I traced the dates with my finger. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend him. She just waited, like someone who'd been carrying a secret too heavy to explain out loud. Whatever this was, it wasn't accidental, and it wasn't new. This wasn't mismanagement. It was something deliberate. Qley flipped to the next page. More statements, more withdrawals, but this time the purpose was unmistakable. These are from online casino sites, she said, sliding the printouts toward me. I found them in his browser history. The site names repeated across the pages. So did the pattern. Deposits that matched the cash withdrawals from the account I'd never known existed. Thousands of dollars, week after week. 15,000 in 6 months, Qley said quietly. That's only what I could document. It wasn't random. The deposits clustered around specific dates. Dates I recognized. I pulled up my texts with Jacob. January 15th, I said. Emergency repair, 700. Qley traced the next line with her finger. January 16th, 800 deposited. We checked 6 months. Every emergency text lined up with a deposit within 24 hours. The money I sent never stabilized his family. It fed the same cycle over and over. There's more, Qley said. She slid out credit card statements, accounts I'd never seen, balances that made my stomach tighten. He uses these to float the real bills, she explained. When you send mortgage money, he moves it here and puts the payment on credit. The debt grows, but it looks normal from the outside. It wasn't chaos, it was a system. Seeing it laid out like that changed how I thought about the last 5 years. The late-night calls, the carefully timed emergencies, the way Jacob always knew exactly how much to ask for. Never a dollar more than I'd hesitate over. This hadn't been desperation, it had been calibration. He'd learned my limits and worked inside them. Pushed just far enough to get what he wanted without triggering questions. The secret account wasn't a mistake, it was insulation. A place to hide behavior he knew he couldn't explain. Looking at the statements, I realized something uncomfortable. The system only worked because I was predictable, reliable, quiet, and the moment I stopped being those things, it collapsed. What hit me next wasn't anger, it was the inventory. I started mentally replaying moments I'd dismissed for years. The rushed phone calls, the way Jacob always needed answers immediately but never had time to talk when things were fine. The way he avoided specifics unless I pressed, and how quickly he changed the subject when I did. Those weren't coincidences, they were safeguards. I realized that every time I hesitated, he'd adjusted. Smaller asks, shorter explanations, just enough urgency to override doubt without triggering resistance. It was a pattern built on observation, not panic. Qley sat across from me, watching the realizations settle. She didn't interrupt, she didn't defend him, she just waited, like someone who'd been living inside this reality long before I'd caught up. By the time I stacked the papers again, the question wasn't whether Jacob had crossed a line. It was how many times he'd crossed it, and how long I'd been standing on the other side pretending it wasn't there. The kids' college accounts, Qley added, they're gone. She didn't elaborate, she didn't need to. The last item wasn't a statement, it was a business card. Mark Dawson, she said. I spoke with him after I realized how deep this went. According to Dawson, taking money under false pretenses, inventing emergencies, hiding accounts, routing funds elsewhere, crossed out of family dysfunction and into fraud. He said you'd have options, Qley told me. Civil, criminal, or neither. That part would be your choice. I stacked the papers neatly. Statements, screenshots, timelines. For the first time since Christmas, the story wasn't confusing anymore. It was documented, and whatever happened next wouldn't depend on excuses, guilt, or family pressure. It would depend on what I decided to do with the truth. Walking to my car, I had a choice to make. I could handle this quietly, cut Jacob off permanently, and walk away. Or I could use what Qley had given me to make sure the damage stopped with me. The evidence was solid. The pattern was clear. Mark Dawson had confirmed that what Jacob had been doing crossed into fraud. Not a misunderstanding, not a bad month, a sustained deception. But moving forward meant consequences that wouldn't stay neatly contained. It would drag Qley's divorce into the open. It would force the kids to learn where their college money had gone. It would fracture the family in ways that wouldn't heal with time or apologies. Holidays would become sides, birthdays would become absences. I'd be the person everyone blamed for what finally surfaced. Walking away had its own risks. Jacob would find another system, another person willing to step in temporarily. Whatever he'd been feeding wouldn't stop just because I wasn't paying for it anymore. I wasn't choosing between kindness and cruelty. What made the decision harder wasn't Jacob. It was the version of myself I'd have to live with afterward. The one who stayed quiet to keep things comfortable. The one who knew the truth and decided it was easier not to use it. If I walked away now, I'd spend the rest of my life explaining why I'd let it continue. To myself. To anyone who eventually figured it out. Silence would look like mercy from the outside, but it would feel like complicity every time I thought about where that money had gone. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the lie to stop with me. I was choosing between silence and accountability. The next morning, I called Qley. Not to ask permission, but to make sure she understood what moving forward could cost her. Jacob's going to blame you, I said. He'll say you betrayed him. They're already lies, Qley replied. I've been living with them for 2 years. Whatever happens next can't be worse than staying. She paused, and I made my choice when I showed you those papers. Qley had already prepared copies of everything. Advice from her lawyer about protecting the kids, a plan that didn't depend on Jacob changing. That afternoon, I called Mark Dawson. His approach wasn't about traps or surprises. It was about documentation, transparency, letting the facts speak without emotion. We'd asked Jacob to meet under the premise of talking through finances. No accusations, no threats, just the opportunity to explain himself with the evidence on the table. Dawson would be there to make sure everything was recorded and to outline the options plainly. Restitution and treatment or formal action. Not punishment, accountability. I wasn't going to ambush my brother. I was going to put the truth in front of him and step back. What he did with it would decide everything that came next. Mark Dawson's office was deliberately neutral. Clean desk, law books lining the shelves, recording equipment set up quietly, almost easy to miss. Nothing about the room felt confrontational, which somehow made it worse. When I called Jacob to set up the meeting, I kept it vague. I want to talk about financial arrangements, I said. Moving forward, maybe we can work something out. The relief in his voice was immediate. That's great, Michael, he said. I knew you'd come around. Family's too important to let pride mess things up. He showed up 15 minutes early, dressed like he was walking into a loan interview. Button-down shirt, khakis, confident posture. The version of himself he used when he needed to look responsible. While we waited for Dawson, Jacob filled the silence easily. Things have been tight lately, he said. Holidays threw everything off. You know how it is, but once things stabilize, we'll be fine again. He spoke like this meeting was a formality. Like the worst thing that had happened was a misunderstanding that needed smoothing over. Like the system that had carried him for 5 years was about to restart. I let him talk. Every sentence assumed I still didn't know, still didn't see, still needed convincing. When Dawson entered and introduced himself as my attorney, Jacob's confidence flickered. Your attorney? He asked. I thought this was just between us. It is, I said. Sit down. Jacob sat, but the ease was gone now. Dawson didn't accuse, he didn't raise his voice, he started with facts. Jacob, can you confirm you've been receiving regular financial support from Michael for approximately 5 years? Yes, but... And the average amount has been around $2,000 per month? Jacob glanced at me. I don't see why we need lawyers for this. Dawson slid the first document across the desk. Bank statements from Jacob's checking account, the one I'd been funding. Transfers in, cash withdrawals out, always within a day. These show consistent cash withdrawals following Michael's transfers, Dawson said. Can you explain where that cash went? Normal expenses, Jacob said quickly. Bills, groceries, kids. Dawson didn't respond. The silence stretched. Jacob shifted in his chair, then kept going. Utilities, insurance, unexpected costs, ordinary words, stacked fast enough to sound convincing. Dawson placed the second stack of documents on the desk. "This is a separate account in your name," he said. "The deposits here match the withdrawals from the account Michael was funding." Jacob's face drained of color when he saw the casino transaction labels. "I can explain that," he said. His voice was thinner now. "The deposits were made to online gambling sites," Dawson continued, "on dates that align with emergency requests made to Michael." Jacob looked at me then. Really looked. That's when he understood Qley had told me everything. He pivoted. "It wasn't gambling like you think," he said. "More like trading. Qley doesn't understand finances." He moved quickly now. Tax reasons, temporary transfers, money that was supposed to be moved back. None of it addressed the documents. "You can't trust her interpretation," he added. "She's emotional." Dawson didn't argue. The timestamps spoke for themselves. Jacob tried one last angle. "You don't understand the pressure I was under," he said. "Supporting a family, keeping things together. Sometimes people need an outlet." Then, quieter, "It's family money." That was when I spoke again. "You said there was no place for losers at your Christmas table." Jacob nodded, relieved to be back on familiar ground. "I was stressed," he said. "I said something stupid." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached into my jacket, pulled out the printed copy of his text, and set it on the table between us. He looked at it, then away. Dawson slid the final document across the desk. A formal notice ending all financial support, along with a summary of the evidence already documented. "These outline your options," Dawson said evenly. "Restitution and treatment or formal proceedings. You don't have to decide today." Jacob stared at the papers, not reading, not arguing. For the first time, there was nothing left for him to manage. "Michael," he said quietly, "think about the kids." "I am," I replied. "That's why this stops here." I stood, nodded once to Dawson, and walked out. Behind me, Jacob remained seated, alone in a quiet office, staring at a version of his life he could no longer edit. Jacob never entered the treatment program. 3 weeks after our meeting, Qley filed for divorce. 2 months later, the house went into foreclosure. Without my monthly transfers, the structure Jacob had built collapsed exactly as fast as it had started cracking. He moved in with a friend, then another, then into a small studio across town. Each move came with fewer options and shorter timelines. For the first time in years, there was no one left to buffer the consequences of his decisions. The kids stayed with Qley. Once the divorce filings became public record and the financial details started circulating, the extended family stopped asking me why I wasn't helping anymore. The question answered itself. Jacob's addiction finally had to face reality without someone else's money cushioning the fall. Qley found a job with better hours and benefits. I helped set up education funds for the kids, accounts Jacob couldn't access, managed by trustees who understood the difference between support and surrender. She moved into a smaller house that was entirely hers. No hidden accounts, no secret debts, no monthly crises that required outside rescue. "It's quiet," she told me during one of our occasional check-ins, "but quiet feels safe now." The kids adapted faster than anyone expected. Stability, it turned out, mattered more than the illusion of prosperity. Some relationships are worth saving. Some are only survivable from a distance. My bank account stays where I put it now. No emergency calls, no urgent texts, no carefully timed requests that demand immediate responses. The money that once disappeared into Jacob's problems now goes toward my own life. Investments, travel, experiences chosen freely instead of funded out of guilt. For the first time in years, my phone doesn't ring at midnight. My savings grow instead of shrink. I sleep without bracing for the next manufactured crisis. The best financial contribution is sometimes knowing when to stop contributing entirely.